If you haven't had companies related to artificial intelligence in your investment portfolio recently, it would have been hard to outperform. AI is being hailed as the next industrial revolution. We're on the brink of artificial general intelligence, we're told. Machines that know everything humans could ever know and can reason their way through real-world problems. Combine those brains with the brawn of robotics, and it's not hard to see why imaginations are running riot. But is the excitement backed up by true application? Is AI more than just a very impressive toy? How much will AI contribute to the economy? Or will the mind-boggling spending required to make it happen be a disappointing drag? I'm Richard Edgar. This is Outperformance Matters, the podcast from Blue Whale Capital. Well, welcome to episode 3, and joining me again is the Chief Investment Officer of Blue Whale Capital, Stephen Yiu. Welcome to you, Stephen.
Hello, Richard.
Hello there. Now, as usual, we'll get to the deep dive on AI in a moment. But first of all, talking about those huge sums that are being spent on AI, you think they're a double-edged sword, don't you?
That's right. I think that a lot of money going to be wasted. So what you want to do from an investing perspective, you need to pick the right size of the spending, which is what we would call the companies that are on the receiving end of any AI spendings rather than AI spenders.
Okay, and do you think that expectations, these wild expectations of what AI can do, are getting ahead of reality?
That point I would disagree, just because I would expect that we are at the early innings of the AI development, or how AI is going to change the world, how it's going to change the way that we conduct our day-to-day, how businesses are going to be run. And at some point, I'm sure the market will be saturated with AI. But what's really important, if you need to be forward-looking in terms of what is yet to come, rather than just looking at the application that have been available today.
Okay, well, I hope that's whetted appetites, because we've got lots more on this a little bit later on with a special guest expert. Well, Stephen, we always start with a section looking at markets and the economy for context on how you see the world that you're investing in. But this time, when we were talking about things that are influencing the world, you said that the rise of Asian companies is crucially important. What do you mean? Why?
So I expect that the dominance of American companies is ending, and which means that we are going to live in a more polarized or multipolar world. And in a way that, of course, many Asian companies previously might not be as dominant as before, but we'll expect them to do a lot better. So the example that I would use is this company called TSMC in Taiwan, is the most advanced manufacturing facility that is basically producing all the semiconductors for Apple, NVIDIA, and AMD. And if you look at the market capitalization of the company, is over $1 trillion. So you can easily consider TSMC as one of the big tech companies in the world, while it's being domiciled in Taiwan rather than in the US. And when you look at the number of things that they're doing, is basically no one is able to replicate what TSMC is doing. And of course, if you follow Trump's policies, they're trying to get a lot of foundries to be built in the US, working with TSMC in terms of getting technology across.
Trying to onshore to reduce the risk of the world's number one chip maker being based in Taiwan, aren't they? But it's a well-known example. I mean, anybody who's investing in technology will know about TSMC. But there is a wave of other globally leading companies coming out of Asia. Can you give us another example?
Yeah, there's another quite recent phenomenon, which is this company called Pop Mart, and they basically are the creator of this toy called Labubu.
Labubu dolls.
Yes, I'm sure many people are familiar with this. I mean, the size of the company today is probably overvalued, but it's being valued at $50 billion. But of course, I think what you need to look in under the bonnet is that they are actually making about $5 billion of revenue. And that $5 billion, just to put in context, is larger than some luxury players like Burberry or Moncler. And it's a natural shift that most things previously was being made in China. If you look at Apple, was designed in California, made in China. But this Labubu is actually created in China, at the same time made in China. So the IP belongs to China and is a global phenomenon as we speak today.
And what's interesting is that Apple is a huge brand that pretty much everybody in the West will have heard of, but British investors might not have heard of PopMart or other companies. So what's the best way of keeping tabs on what's going on in terms of this shift and where the created in China as well as made in China, where that is an important and globally significant development?
I think everyone should have a global hat on in terms of keeping their eye open in terms of where the opportunity is going to come. And it doesn't matter whether they're British, Chinese, or American, or European. I think you just need to keep an open eye. But what is really important is most people who are based in the UK would probably think that the FTSE 100 index, which I would say 2/3 of them would be overseas earners, so not being exposed to domestic British economy. They would think like investing into FTSE 100 companies would mean investing globally. That's not true at all. Just because a lot of these companies are, I would say, of legacy, like banks, oil and gas company, some pharmaceutical companies. If you look at the last 8 years of return for FTSE 100 index, it's actually compounding at less than 7% per annum. And if you look at the world stock market, it's compounded at over 10%. So what I'm trying to say here is there's always a differentiation. While you could be making money overseas in some foreign country, but doesn't mean that's the investment opportunity that you want to get exposure to. So I think people just need to be a bit more open in terms of where those opportunities might come, and irrespective of where they're domiciled.
So British investors should lift their eyes to the horizon, and certainly the horizon to the east.
Correct.
Well, our deep dive topic this time is artificial intelligence, as we said in the introduction, but we're looking at it from an investment perspective. A couple of weeks ago, Claire, a listener, wrote in after hearing the first episode of Outperformance Matters, and she asked,
do you see a potential bubble emerging in the AI sector? Do you do anything to mitigate against that risk?
well, you've got the Blue Whale team thinking, Claire. A lot of the companies at the heart of AI have seen their valuations explode, which is great if you're along for the ride, but how long will they keep on growing? Some investors are getting nervous that this might be a little bit like the dot-com boom a quarter of a century ago. In other words, should we be ready for a crash? Well, Stephen, first of all, let's start with you. Are you nervous?
So there are a few things going on here. I'm very cautious about any AI spending that's going into the arena today, but we are quite optimistic about any companies that are on a receiving end, any spending. And I think what's really important to remember, put in context of the tech bubble, was most companies were not profitable at the time. And if you look at majority of the companies today, including NVIDIA, Broadcom, and also the AI spenders, they are highly profitable. So this is a very different scenario. At the same time, I just want to bring people back to the days if you ended up doing shopping online during the 2000s period, is you probably take you an hour to check out from Amazon with 2 items in your basket. But of course, today, the frictional forces for the adoption of AI is very little, in a way that is all about data analytics, and all our data is on cloud. So I think it's just very important to remember that the adoption rate and the penetration is going to take off much quicker than anything else we've seen before.
Because the infrastructure is there. We're ready now to accept this huge new tool.
That's right.
However, people are getting uncomfortable, as I said. There's really crazy valuations on some companies, it seems. Or am I buying this skepticism? Do you think they're not crazy because of the potential?
You just need to differentiate the companies, I think, on a very high level from an investing perspective. And if you ended up investing into the likes of NVIDIA or Broadcom, I mean, they're highly profitable with a very, very high margin. And there's a natural transfer of free cash flow from the big tech companies to some of these companies that are on the receiving end of any spending. So you want to pick the picks and shuffle companies that are very certain in terms of what they're making now in terms of profits.
So, well, that certainty, because Claire asked about mitigating risk and, obviously choosing the right companies, but you're saying the picks and the shovels, the people who are supplying the big spenders.
Correct. And of course, then you want to avoid the companies that you are not certain about whether they're going to get any economics on the back of the spending. And we are very cautious on many of these companies that are spending a huge amount of money investing into AI.
Okay, well, Stephen, we've been joined on the sofa here by Mohammed Mulla, who is Blue Whale's in-house guru on AI, an analyst and co-portfolio manager as well. Welcome to you.
Hi, Richard.
Now, Mo, being an expert on AI, I imagine, must take some stamina because there is just a torrent of information, constant change. How do you stay on top of what matters, and what's your way of disregarding the noise?
I think most of that just comes through experience. So obviously, the more time you spend in any sector, the more experienced you become in terms of what's relevant and what's not. And I probably have a list on Twitter of 300 people in AI that I follow. And over time, you realize where the signal lies and where the noise is. And so it's quite, over time, it becomes quite easy to differentiate.
Okay, I mean, 300 sounds like quite a lot to be following, to be honest. But it's amazing where the sources of information about AI come from, I think, at the moment. It's not the old ways of researching, is it? You've got to be on top of different sources.
Yeah, I mean, we use, for example, we watch the semi-analysis content, or read a lot of the semi-analysis content that they put out. So that's Dylan Patel and his team. There are lots of podcasts nowadays that happen in the AI sphere. Then, as I say, on Twitter, you have all sorts of people discussing different parts of AI as well. So it might be generative AI, it might be robotics, or it might be autonomous vehicles. But there are individuals who are specialists in each of those areas.
Let's talk about the frontier models. What the capabilities are of these models isn't always clear, and neither is it clear, to me at least, where you can actually make money. Are you convinced by that at the moment, or is it still the potential which excites you?
I think there's a broad dispersion. So obviously there are some areas where AI, and generative AI is currently what we're discussing, but if you think about it, Meta has been applying AI within its recommendation algorithms for quite a long time. And so you have definitely seen the fruits of that. On the most recent Meta earnings report, they mentioned that ad conversions on Instagram are up 5% and on Facebook were up 3%. And that is largely to do with the work that they're doing on recommendations. So you can see certainly there's some ROI there. I think we've spoken before about software and software development, and obviously in a very natural use case for using LLMs and generative AI is on things which require some basic logic. So it makes sense that it works on software development and coding, so it works quite well there. There are lots of areas where you can argue that we're still waiting to see the results. One example might be anything which requires numbers. These LLMs have historically struggled on. But then O1, which is an OpenAI reasoning or thinking model that was released roughly around a year ago, has begun to close some of that capability gap, because now it can offload some of the numerical parts to something, it can write a mini bit of code or a tool which will do the math for you, the calculation for you. And so bits and pieces are slowly getting solved over time. And I think we continue to see AI progress enabling more and more applications. So
there is potential. Things are gradually making progress. Who are the winners? Who are the ones who are going to fall by the wayside? You've got to be very careful, haven't you? And doing a lot of crystal ball gazing.
Yeah, and I think even at this stage, it's just so difficult to definitively say, here are the winners and here are the losers. So I think, we like to approach it with a very open mind. I think one of the things that we probably noticed quite early was that the silicon side of things, or the infrastructure side of things, would be, the first area where spend would have to increase considerably. And we saw it as an area which was kind of almost non-discretionary spend, because if you don't begin to invest, then maybe there's an existential risk for your business.
I can see Stephen's nodding along to that. That's the bit you were talking about, the picks and the shovels,
right. Yes, exactly.
The suppliers to...
And then I guess over time, then there is obviously the discussion about, okay, well, what other areas are interesting to look at or invest in? And, software has been an area where people have, very wide-ranging views, and, software relative performance versus, say, semiconductors hasn't been particularly strong of late. And I think there is difficulty in knowing who's going to be the winners within software and who are going to be the losers. And so I think, high-level thesis you could probably argue is that those that are systems of record or have lots of proprietary data sat inside those systems or software databases will perform, relatively better than apps which don't have any real lock-in or tie. And so it is very difficult. We prefer to, go where there's certainty or a high degree of certainty. And so far that's been in infrastructure and silicon.
But let's go back to data, because you were talking about that. Because there's a lot of controversy in how the LLMs have been trained in pretty much hoovering up everything that's ever been written, and it's now locked in. Great, they know that much. But what do you mean by data is going to be important? Do you mean that sort of data?
Yeah, that's been somewhat important. So, for example, Google has the YouTube library, and you could argue that's highly proprietary now. Other labs might have trained based on the YouTube library as well. But we're thinking also about organizations. Walmart will have so much data on its customers, and what time they spend at and what they spend on, household size and shopping habits in general. And that can inform lots of different things. And, whether it's like promoting to those individuals at certain times of the week or certain days of the week, or it could be even on the inventory side of things, how much of X do we need, a specific time of week? And so then say it's perishable goods, you can manage that inventory much better. And so that's very valuable data to have as well.
And let's talk about the downside to this incredible growth in AI. There's a lot of controversy about the amount of power that the chips, the processing units use, and how are things developing on that front? Because a lot of people have heard of the GPUs, the graphics processing units that NVIDIA makes that were used for gaming, but things are moving on and potentially in a good way, I gather.
Yeah, so I think Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI, did mention, I think, either this year or last year in a blog post, the average ChatGPT query consumes the amount of electricity that an oven running for 1 second would consume, which might not sound like a lot, but if you think about how many queries are put through ChatGPT, that's an awful lot of energy.
And making the world a bit hotter as it goes.
Exactly. And that's all currently run on GPU infrastructure. Now, if the rumors are to be believed, then OpenAI is working on a application-specific integrated circuit or a custom chip. And so once a workload gets sufficiently large, you can offload that workload to a highly specific chip, which runs that specific workload, much, much faster, much more power efficiently, and at lower cost ultimately. And so that is a promising area.
A shift from a general hardware to things that do one thing and do it very well.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Now, I want to bring you, Stephen, in on this, because this sounds a little bit like DeepSeek, which sort of rattled some cages when it burst onto the scene a few months ago. Everything seems to be not that long ago. But one of the key things with DeepSeek is that it seems to be much more efficient. How are the dynamics working there in the market?
Yeah, so there are a few things going on here. Obviously, the market was very in a panic mode when DeepSeek came out in January time. But what we're actually seeing is DeepSeek is the most welcoming development in the AI domain, just because it's lower the cost of training, at the same time the energy intensity. And of course, from AI adoption rates perspective, that we welcome more competitions.
Okay, so that's interesting that it's beginning to take shape. That's the future winners are beginning to form around a way that they can distinguish themselves. And just before we get into that, I noticed that Andreessen Horowitz, they're a venture capital company. They keep tabs on the most successful applications in AI, and ChatGPT is number 1, DeepSeek is number 3. But 22 of the top 50 mobile applications are from China. And even though most of them are only being used within China itself. So there's a whole different ecosystem that is that's developing, isn't it?
That's right. Yeah. I mean, if you look at the general population, China is definitely it's like 20% of the world population as a starting point, and hence and at the same time they are quite mobile native in a way, just because they probably have skipped a journey about the tech bubble era. So everyone have a mobile devices. They are very sophisticated in terms of the WeChat, in terms of like doing shopping on your apps, like ordering taxi, doing a lot of things online. And hence, like if you think about AI, just going back to the point I made earlier, it's about frictional forces of adoption, and there's literally no frictional forces in that setting. And of course, the Chinese are not allowed to use OpenAI or Meta AI or Grok, and hence they are going to basically make the Chinese application more dominant within China at least.
Either way, there's a lot of human brains are being applied to developing lots of different platforms, and they're coming up with different solutions. And that one is your point is that it's furthering the adoption and the penetration of people using these AI tools. And Mo, coming back to you and the proprietary data, can you give me some examples of how companies are actually creating their own moat around them in how they apply AI?
Yeah, perhaps it's easier to think about, maybe where the end state would be here. So I think one of my favorite things to think about is how, for example, booking a holiday will look in maybe 3 years' time or 5 years' time. And you could probably expect a very hyper-personalized experience. So, over time, these systems will learn all of your preferences, what hotels you enjoy staying at. It'll probably know, what kind of content you're consuming in that moment. If you're into ancient, if your kids are watching ancient history videos on a certain social media platform, it'll probably at some point be able to pick that up. And so then when you're booking your holiday, the itinerary is basically planned by the super agent, effectively. It gets shown to you, and then you will obviously review it. And then once you decide you want to book it, there'll be the agentic AI behind the scenes, which will then go off and book your itinerary, whether it's your flights, your hotels, but also, the excursions or the day trips to the museums or whatever it is. And then at the same time, any error handling, if you like, say your flight time changes and then your itinerary gets pushed, or, you're going to arrive at the hotel later and you need to rebook certain flights, whatever, that all will be done agentically or autonomously behind the scenes. And so then you can begin to wonder, okay, well then who are the natural beneficiaries of this kind of thing? Who has that data? And so then you'd obviously begin to look at the booking.coms or the Expedias or,
Okay, so potential for growth. And given that the theme of this podcast is outperformance, Stephen, do you think it's the AI companies or companies that are incorporating AI, either side, that are the source of future outperformance in terms of market share and how that's reflected in their share prices?
I think the way to think about this is as a starting point, many of these AI companies have done quite well over the last few years. I think what you need to expect is the rate of return that you get from some of these companies would be a bit lower compared to before, which was quite explosive, I would say, over the last 2 years or so. But of course, the penetration, adoption level in the general population have barely started, right? We're at the early innings. So we would expect some companies that would come out as the true winners, just like during the tech bubbles, like many companies ended up disappearing. They ended up spending a lot of money, but they're no longer with us today. And just bear in mind that Google Search was the 7th search engine being created. So they weren't the pioneer in terms of search engine, but where's the other 6 today?
Well, let me bring Mo in again then on the risks. What might turn the story sour? What might make somebody be the next Netscape or AOL or one of these companies that has declined?
Yeah, I think it can be difficult to know it exactly in this moment. I think obviously there is this, preference to have a lot of data. So to the extent that you can have some kind of, because at the moment you could argue, well, what is a lock-in on any of these models? And the biggest lock-in that ChatGPT probably has on me or Gemini has on me is that they have my data. I've already spoken to it so much about various aspects of life. And so it picks up certain bits and pieces about you. Maybe you just want to then stick to that model. But really, currently there's no very firm lock-in. So maybe something superior, or a superior model comes out, and all of a sudden there's no brand loyalty, and you're not going to stay with ChatGPT.
And risks to existing companies as what they do is suddenly an ability of an AI platform. I'm thinking here of some of the incredible video capabilities that are emerging.
Yeah, I mean, Google yesterday just launched, or perhaps the day before, a new image model, and for the first time, you can truly edit an image that you upload into it, and that obviously then begins to encroach on Adobe's territory. And there are obviously many instances of this you can think of, but we use Bloomberg on a daily basis, and so far you could argue that Bloomberg's AI capability isn't in any way meaningful. And so the longer that is an issue, then new companies will emerge and perhaps encroach on some of that. Obviously, there are certain lock-ins around data. So if you don't have the data to begin with, it's difficult to build what Bloomberg's built. But if you give it 5 years and Bloomberg still doesn't have a very sellable AI solution, then the switching could happen.
Let me ask you about NVIDIA, because it's the company that you've in some ways made your name with by spotting its success early. What's next for NVIDIA? Mo, it's a company you cover very closely.
Yeah.
What should we be excited about that's coming next? It's obviously one of the most scrutinized companies in the world, but what have you got your eye on, and how the next couple of years will pan out?
Yeah, I think the next big thing is going to be that NVIDIA has built out an operating system, if you like, for physical AI called NVIDIA Omniverse. And that's something which we're very enthusiastic about. It'll take a few years to get adopted fully. But this allows simulation of the physical world in software, and it's all grounded in physics as well. And so anything that you expect to happen in the real world, if a robot, for example, in a factory hits something, that robot will behave in the simulation as it would in the real world, which is difficult to do because these are not pre-baked scenes. And so Omniverse is something that we're incredibly excited about. I guess the other one that we're excited about, perhaps not directly NVIDIA, but would obviously use NVIDIA's chips, is computer-aided drug discovery. I think is something which is very exciting. Cadence talk about it a lot, actually. And I think what's exciting there is, if you think about it, the semiconductor industry has simulated chips for a very long time, such that virtually 100% of a chip is simulated, which means that by the time it comes out of the manufacturer, once it comes out of TSMC's factories, that chip will work first time. There's not much prototyping that goes on or any of that. Now, in drug discovery, none of that really happens, and so you spend $2 billion roughly to develop a drug. That research discovery process can take 10 years or so. And
with lots and lots of testing on humans. Yeah. And your point is you can speed that up without the risks and the delays that happen when you're...
And you can use AI to generate new compounds and look at new targets. And ultimately, if you find that a compound doesn't work, or you've simulated it in a human body and you realize it doesn't work, you can discard it before that compound's even left the computer. And so suddenly the costs associated with drug discovery drop drastically. But also, the idea of personalized medicine or the reality is much closer.
Much closer. Stephen, what's exciting you?
So going back to Claire's point, I think this is what is interesting is, like, if you are looking at all the AI applications that's been developed to date, which is your ChatGPT, your image generation, like checking your grammar for email, etc., we've got too many GPUs today. But if we take a forward-looking view, which is echoing what Mo have just said about drug discovery, about the omniverse, robotics, there's many things that we have not actually seen yet is coming in the coming foreseeable futures. Then we are at the very early innings of this AI journey. And of course, then what do we need to go through that journey is you need to do more trainings. And hence, I think you go back to the companies that are on the receiving end of any spendings.
We ain't seen nothing yet. Thank you both very much indeed. Mo, thank you in particular.
Thank you, Richard.
Well, Stephen, every episode I ask you to rummage around in your Outperformance Matters myth-busting toolkit, finding a myth about investing that people get wrong. So what is your choice this time?
The myth is share price volatility is a risk. What is really important is, as we know, that the equities goes up and down, and hence, like, volatility is part of the market investing in the equity domain. But what is really important is about permanent loss of capital that's due to the structural changes in a company rather than some macro positioning or rotation. So hence, people should not be seeing share price volatility as a risk, but you should focus on company fundamentals.
Look through the little ups and downs and instead focus on the long-term trajectory.
That's right.
Well, we've discussed the rise of Asian companies, some of which might not be on many people's radar because markets like Taiwan aren't regarded as developed yet, despite the cutting-edge tech that's being manufactured there. Then onto our deep dive on AI. Blue Whale seems definitely not worried that this is a flash in the pan. It's an adapted Churchillian, not the beginning of the end, perhaps not even the end of the beginning. We're out of time, though, so thanks to Stephen and Mo for sharing their insight, and thank you for listening or indeed watching. If you'd enjoyed the show, please follow Outperformance Matters and leave a review, and we welcome and respond to questions and feedback. Do write to producer@bluewhale.co.uk. That's producer@bluewhale.co.uk. Until next time, remember, Outperformance matters. Goodbye.
Please note that this podcast is issued for educational purposes only by Blue Whale Capital LLP, which is authorised and regulated by the Financial Conduct Authority. Views expressed on companies, markets, asset classes, and investment strategies do not constitute investment recommendations and must not be viewed as such. Listeners should note that any views expressed may already have been acted upon, may no longer be current, and may not be revised or updated. Nothing in the podcast should be viewed as comment on the suitability of any investment. If you're unsure of the suitability of any investment for your needs, or if you feel that you do not fully understand the risks of investing, you should obtain financial advice from a reputable professional financial advisor before proceeding. You are reminded that your capital is at risk. The value of investments could go down as well as up, so you may get back less than you invest. Tax treatment depends on personal circumstances and may change. This podcast is directed only at UK residents and does not constitute an offer or a solicitation in any jurisdiction.